The title of today's webinar is using data to navigate the changing rental market. Sounds wonky and all that. We're going to try to keep it really kind of down to earth and talk about some of the things that we all know are facing the market. Just to sort of set the stage a little bit, we all know we're in a situation that's unlike really anything anybody's ever seen before, particularly inside the New York City rental ecosystem. There's a huge market dislocation going on. What we wanted to do with this forum today was have a kind of very ad hoc, comfortable conversation around the current environment, understanding where we are to some extent, more importantly, where we're headed and why we may be headed in one way or another. To do this, we've convened some industry experts, folks that have been in this business for a while, each leaders in their field, each having guided through their organizations through prior crises. And I think importantly, whose positions give them perspective and observational ability inside the current environment so they can gain really good insights about where we are. The format of the webinars we run are Q&A. I'm going to ask some questions as sort of conversation starters, move us around as a moderator, and we'll let the discussions go from there. It is fairly ad hoc, so we will go from panelist to panelist. Please use the Q&A link that's at the bottom of your Zoom panel to submit the questions, not the chat panel. The chat panel is for panelists. We'd like to use the Q&A panel for audience questions. We will get to as many of those as we can during the session. I will either weave them into the conversation that we're already having, particularly if it's a follow-up, or I'll come right out and say, hey, we have a really great question in the chat room. What do you guys think about this? Or if we have time, we'll try to tackle more at the end. The survey, we will have a survey that will follow this right after we're done. I'll close and we're going to put a survey up, very, very brief, only a few questions long. We'd love you guys to please stay aboard and fill that out. It's like radial button, click, 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 and gone. To help us understand if we're giving you things that are valuable to you, additional questions, topics, things you'd like to see us cover in the future. Let me get a few introductions out of the way before we get right into it. My name is Steve Lord. I'm a strategic advisor to Elegran. I've been that way for about 2 years. I've got about 25 years now in middle market CFO and COO engagements, one CEO engagement. Started my career providing pretty in-depth macroeconomic and financial research to institutional investors in the city. I'm also right now pretty active in disaster relief. I serve as a liaison officer for FEMA's Region 2, which has kept me pretty busy in the last few weeks. Turning over to our panelists, Adam, I'm coughing as I say your name. Adam Meshiko is one of the founders of LEAP, which provides rent default insurance for multifamily housing across the United States. Really good insights into what's happening inside the rental ecosystem. We have Joe Benzvi, who's founder of Vero Leasing, who provides a virtual leasing platform, enables renters and property owners and brokers to kind of all complete that leasing process with an unprecedented amount of speed, security, ease of use, modern technology, all really good stuff. Also a person who's sort of at the crux of this whole ecosystem and can see different elements of it. Then we have Deborah Dorella Sharon. She's got 20 years in the New York City real estate property market, specializing primarily in new developments, which also gives her a tremendous view into that part of this ecosystem. She's worked for top real estate developers and marketing firms as a team leader and is currently the leasing director for 160 Madison. And then lastly on our panel, we have Jared Anton. Jared is our sort of chief everything officer at Elegran. That's what he does. His nominal title is he's director of sales. He's the one who's responsible for Elegran sales team, professional development of our brokerage associates. Jared has incredible knowledge, both firsthand and through the research he does, about the rental and sales brokerage industry in New York. Just tremendous insights, and it was a pleasure to have him aboard as well. So welcome to all of you guys. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We all Zoom probably more than we wanted to ever, so I'm really happy, really grateful, frankly, that you guys were able to join us for this. What I'd like to do is kind of kick this off with, kind of a, hey, is it safe to move right now? I mean, it's a legit question, right? Because there's a lot of restrictions around really doing anything in the city. We're getting closer. I think New York City is probably first or second week of June to entering into phase one of the New York recovery phases. But for right now, it's still a really legit question. Jared, Deborah, what do you guys think?
Hey, Steve. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Yes, it is a question we're hearing quite often. And the answer is it depends, right? Everyone's going to have their own personal threshold in terms of what they feel is safe and in their best interest. And everyone's going to have different needs in terms of their motivating factors. So the reality is yes, moving companies are deemed essential. You are able to move right now. There have been a number of moves taking place, although the quantity of them are, substantially down from last year.
Mm-hmm. And were movers in general considered essential? Like, I mean, has the moving activity continued, or has it kind of stopped?
So movers were deemed essential about 1 week into the on pause. Governor Cuomo had added them to that list at that time. And moving companies will report decent volumes. We're seeing, also an uptick in moves that are taking place from New York and going to locations outside of New York City.
Okay, great. Deborah, what are you guys seeing at 160 Madison?
We're allowing move-ins and move-outs. Obviously, I didn't have a lot of move-outs, thank goodness, over the last 90 days. But
Right.
we're trying to keep as many people as possible. We've limited it to one move a day if we can, so that things can be wiped down and really handled properly, both for the safety of the staff, the building, and the new resident. That seems to be working. We haven't had to deviate from that yet. So yeah, I'm thrilled, because I think to stop that flow would have been really difficult when you already have deals, people moving out and people who you've re-rented to.
Right. And how do folks accommodate that? Like, if they want to move, do they talk to their building, and it's all kind of ad hoc depending on what the building's policies are? And if they want to move to a place, should they reach out to that building's management, understand what those policies look like? Or is there any kind of uniform, like, this is how we do it?
I think it's traditional, except for I see that condos are being more difficult to move out and in and out of. I know people whose moves were just put on hold. And so, yeah, you check with your building and then you check with us, and then we schedule the time. There were people who were just nervous about moving during this time. And even if we were just coming 3 blocks, because it's like, your services and right, exactly. But my staff is really well prepared. My resident manager is amazing, and we have our own loading dock. So we've been able to keep it fairly controlled, and people seem very, satisfied.
Okay, great, cool. And that will probably only get easier as we get a look at what climbing out of this whole thing looks like. I'm sure those policies will kind of coalesce into a standard sort of approach. So just
to piggyback on what Deborah said, she said something really important. So, most rental buildings are going to have more flexible and permissive policies right now to move in or out of, because the rental buildings rule will need that in order to continue to rent their apartments. Condos and co-ops are going to be more restrictive, and that's because to the board, it doesn't really matter if someone can move in and out. It's not affecting their bottom line, so they're going to try to protect the residents. Right. We've seen those buildings get locked down a little bit more than rental buildings, so just to keep in mind.
Okay, good, thanks. So we're going to get to this a little bit later, I think, but while we're here, assuming I want to move and I've maybe seen a building I'd like to be in, how are tours happening? How are we able to see? I can't really necessarily go do showings, and I can't really go look at example apartments. How is this process happening? And a follow on to that question, Joe, Deborah, I don't know if you guys want to hop into there, but yeah. What is the corollary to the question is, will it stay that way? Or what do you guys think will happen, or how quickly do you think it'll happen that we're back to physical, on-site inspections?
Well, I think the on-site will depend on Governor Cuomo, won't it? With the phase in, when we'll be able to open up. I can control the amount of traffic that I have coming in and out, right, with appointments. So I think it'll depend on how the first phase happens. We're doing most, it's interesting because, now Street Easy also allows you to put up a virtual tour. We use that as our first line of defense. Jared, I don't know about you, where someone says, I'm interested in this. We send them the videos that we have. Once we get them engaged, we then usually want to take them, what we would do, our next level would be FaceTime directly in the apartment and see the building. My agent lives in the city, so vacant apartments this is only for a vacant apartment. And then we're able to really do a full tour on FaceTime. It's amazing.
On FaceTime, yeah.
Yeah, and engage. And it's worked very nicely for us.
Do you guys think people will still want to do it that way, even after they're maybe legally allowed to go? People are still going to be nervous, right? So do you think that sort of breakthrough that, yes, you can actually do a pretty good job with a virtual tool, you think that'll stay, or some version of that will stay?
I don't want it to, guys. I mean, I love the contact, but I think it's going to be about do people feel safe, right, Jared? Go ahead.
I think that in the short term, at least, virtual tours are going to be the first pass. So you look at 10 apartments, you shortlist 4 or 5, and you go see those. I believe that prospective buyers and prospective tenants are going to need to be, pre-vetted before those in-person showings can occur.
We're doing that.
And that could continue way beyond the pandemic crisis, right? That could just be a shift in how we do this now. Kind of like Zoom. We're going to do a lot of meetings going forward in Zoom when it's just not convenient to meet anymore, whereas we would have either rescheduled it or made some other accommodation to make sure we got in person. We've all learned that we can do it this way, right? Yeah. So while we're here again, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Steve, what I was going to say is, I think it's going to be, do they feel comfortable, right? So I have kits with masks and wipes and booties and gloves so that when they come to the building, everybody's covered.
Right. And everybody feels safe.
And then you do your social distancing. Yeah. I think that'll be the next, when we go back on site and we see clients, I think we'll be with the PPE for a while, guys.
I do too.
Yeah. Yeah.
So while we're here, let's just keep on that track. What is like Joe, I know you see all sort of elements of this leasing process. What does that look like? Any changes virtually that you think are either here now and will be gone once we unlock, or that might have shifted a little bit?
Absolutely. I would say that everything is breaking in a good way. And what we've seen over the past decade already is a migration and transition to using technology to virtualize as much of our lives. In real estate specifically, I mean, people should know that you've been able to rent an apartment sight unseen for quite some time. In fact, it used to be, what someone who couldn't visit the apartment would do. So that was based on convenience. Now it's shifted more around safety. But the online search has gone virtual. You no longer need to go to a real estate office in order to provide your information to conduct the search. That's all virtual. The actual lease signing through platforms like ours and comparable tools out there, it used to be exchanged via email. You would execute it and scan it and send it back. Now you do it through a very modern portal. You pay online, and the only thing you can do online is actually move in. But that's now an essential service, and everyone has to do that anyway. So what we've seen is a really more adoption versus a whole new way of leasing. It's more adopting the technologies that before really were a convenience, but now are a necessity.
Yes, accelerated the adoption really, right?
Yeah, and it's fascinating. The virtual showings, they all look so amazing. I've just as an anecdote, I used to be an agent, and the most fearful moment you ever have as an agent is when you hold a key to an apartment and you don't know what to expect when you open that door. So you have to be really prepared what's inside. So the good news is these renters that were either kind of like leaving a messy apartment are not there. There's no one to, usher someone through other than this really highly curated experience. And what I'm seeing is it's a much more controlled delivery of the value of the apartment. A lot of times you open the door, you say, here's the kitchen, here's the living room. And now it's more like, this is where the heart of the home is. And someone could really take it all in. Naturally, I think floor plans are, overlooked need now, but this is how people measure whether they'll fit into the apartment. So I think there's still some sort of demand for in-person physical, and I won't name any names. I know there's some agencies out there that are still doing these showings, but it's essentially to kind of seal the deal versus to qualify the apartment. And I think
So it's more on the back end than the front.
People are
Interesting.
wasting less time traveling, looking at apartments. They're already doing a lot of that filtering up front. And we see that through, although a drop in applications, but more completions of applications. And this is something that's quite data driven. I mean, it's undeniable. There are more
Mhm.
people that are finishing applications they've started than ever before, but they're applying for less units, which is really a
Mhm.
function of they've already filtered out what
They
they're doing.
vetted it out. Yep.
My
And
recommendation there is like make your video phenomenal and really punch in as much key attributes of the apartment.
the
Make it
the
as
Instagram age for for rentals, right?
exactly.
We're going to get to this a little bit later, or a flavor of it, but I wanted to loop in Adam. And so, Adam, how from the rent, and we've got a couple questions that I want to get to shortly on concessions. But before we go there, in this new virtual world, does anything change in the underwriting in terms of rental insurance? If maybe nobody has sat down and actually talked to the person until they're moving in.
Yeah, I mean, what we're seeing is, during this current environment, there's a lot more risk, right? I mean, we
Mhm.
have a lot of policies and legislation in place, and there's a lot more risk to landlords, and landlords kind of at their core are risk averse. So, we are starting to see, there's been a lot of financial changes to people's day to day, and we have kind of changed our underwriting to kind of deal with this current economic environment.
Mhm.
At Leap, we are a credit enhancement tool. So our
Mhm.
tool is to help prospective renters get qualified that might not have the best credit. They might not have the income qualifications that a typical New York landlord is looking for. And we're here to kind of help bridge that gap.
Help them, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, we're really a tool for landlords, but more importantly, we're really a tool for the renter. And we're breaking down the barriers to make it easier to get approved.
Mhm.
And as we underwrite, especially young professionals coming into the workforce and students who don't always have, a tri-state guarantor, our goal is really to be here and be there to help them get into the apartment they like. I mean, we work with about 90,000 units across the city. So, we've changed our underwriting accordingly.
Okay, good. And we're going to get to insurance in a little bit. I just wanted to throw that out there because we were kind of there and it seemed like it would be a good question. It's a question I had. So for whatever that's worth, we've gotten a couple questions in here about concessions and rental process now. So it sort of ties in with the agenda that we had in mind, but why don't we pivot to there? So how should people be, either negotiating or renegotiating these rental leases? We have, I'll just go ahead and read it. We have one question about, what should people be asking for in a rental renewal, right? What concessions are out there? People have heard, they're getting 1 month free or 2 months free, or they're getting a rent reduction. And then some people are seeing, the opposite, or the concessions are coming to them in so novel ways. Some people aren't getting any concessions. Let's tackle that a little bit. It seems like obviously it's a very important topic for our industry and our attendees. So, we were going to tackle concessions a little bit further down in the agenda, but let's go there now. Jared, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So I think it's important to note that pre-COVID in January and February, we were seeing rent increases of 6 to 8%. So 6 to 8% increases year over year. And that was really the first time in 4 or 5 years that we were seeing such increases, right? Rents have been largely flat for the last half of the prior decade. So right now, as COVID, came in late March, we saw landlords in, late March into early April offer flexible renewal terms. So instead of doing the standard 12-month renewal, they were allowing tenants to extend for 3 months, 6 months, in some cases even month to month. And they were doing it largely with no rent increase, because keeping a paying tenant in there, that was a tenant in good standing, was better than risking it being vacant with an uncertain time to re-rent. We're seeing that landlords now are renewing leases at that no increase, in some cases 1, 2, maybe 3% decrease in certain situations. My understanding is landlords are not going to advertise this in flashing red lights. you know, you
Right.
sort of have to ask and have a conversation. So if you have a lease coming up, the best thing that you can do is have an open dialogue with your landlord. Most leases have a 60-day renewal clause. So that means that at least 60 days before the end of your lease, you would need to be speaking with your landlord, explaining your intention, whether to renew or not renew, and having these conversations. Deborah can
Right. I think,
certainly chime in more.
and yeah, sure. Go ahead.
No, so, you know, we send out, I traditionally would like to send out at 120 days, right? I'm rent stabilized. The last month or two, I decided to do 90 days because we're just all trying to figure out what needs to be done here. And same thing, I have close relations with my residents. I think it's really great to talk to them. You know, what happens is when you're doing concessions on new deals and you have renewals, you always have to find that balance, guys,
Sure.
right? Because they're saying you're going to do that for somebody new coming in, but you're
So
not
what
going
about
to do it
me?
to me.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's always based on market conditions and inventory. But I am being very sensitive to my upcoming months, which are very large. And I'm going to do my best to keep every single person. So that means I'm going to incentivize for them. And I'm definitely going to, you know, I think it's going to be a no increase because it just makes sense, right? I'm at the higher end of the market. I'm a rent stabilized building. It would make sense than having to do decreases and you know, so we'll see. And same thing with concessions, I think, on new deals. I'm trying to stay conservative, but it's hard to stay conservative when every other building is given away.
Well, yeah, that's it. That's the problem with this.
Jared,
It's a
right?
race to
2
the bottom,
months,
right?
3 months, right?
Yeah.
But I can kind of stay my threshold and know what I can do just based on the kind of inventory that I'm sitting with, which is a lot less than a lot of other buildings. So yeah, I think it's really, you stay close and you have the conversations.
And as Jared mentioned, these deals, these concessions, you know, whatever you're doing, you're not going to shout about them from the firehouse roof. So renters need to come and talk to you, right? They need to ask. They need to come and have a dialogue. I think that's a big takeaway. What do you guys see while we're here? Is there large differences between different neighborhoods? What's happening in Midtown may be different than what's happening in Chelsea. And then a follow on to that is, you know, do you envision this to be much more of a renter's market or a buyer's market, a seller's market in the fall?
So
It's a jump ball. Anybody can hop in.
It's neighborhood specific. You have to understand the amount of inventory that's in a neighborhood. So you look at Long Island City, you look at Midtown West, that 42nd Street corridor, that's 57th Street corridor. There's a lot of inventory there. There's a lot of rental buildings. They've always been very concession heavy, similar with Financial District. You contrast that with, you know, Murray Hill, Gramercy, Soho, West Village, Tribeca. The inventory is going to be fewer. You know, so it all goes into the balancing in terms of the power between tenant and landlord. So someone needs a tenant who's considering, do I stay or do I go? You know, needs to consider what is the cost to actually move, right? Because there's a time cost and there's a monetary cost, and now there's a safety thing that everyone has to weigh. So, you know, if I can save a couple bucks, is it worth the hassle to move to go to another building with some better concessions, or do I just stay put, happy with
Just
the no
sit tight.
Exactly.
Right. And do you think prices stay more or less stable through here? Or you guys mentioned, you know, a flat renewal is potentially where we'll be. Do you think anybody starts dropping prices to keep people or attract new ones?
So generally landlords are hesitant to drop the gross rent. They do it via other ways, such as flexibility on lease dates, you know, concessions such as compensating the broker, free rent, amenities. So we'll see things like that come and disappear without really a trace. I don't really believe that on the aggregate we'll see the gross rents really decrease.
Yeah, headline numbers drop, right?
Correct.
Okay, cool. And we just got a question in the Q&A that I think is relevant to bring in here. Where would you guys point folks in terms of resources to learn about what concession trends are happening in their individual neighborhoods, if it is different like that? You know, do they just talk to their broker? Are there websites out there, data trackers, whatever?
So I could jump in and maybe kick it off with what I've seen. So we sit on inventory and we're familiar with whether these units are actually occupied or not occupied. So I think there's some data, first of all, that no one has that is important to know, plays a factor in how many units are about to hit the market.
Right.
So there's some portfolios out there that really focus on luxury, a luxury setup, whether it be a really high-end kitchen, high-end unit, amazing amenities. And typically there's already a certain amount of inventory that's never online, whether the unit's getting painted, renovated. But what we've seen is a pretty big spike of, in some instances, as high as 30% of the units are actually not currently getting rent paid on them. And the owner operator is thinking, what do I do?
What do I do now? Yeah.
What do I do now? So I think now's the time to actually try to make a move if you're a renter looking to get a good deal, because this is before owners and operators already have their formulas figured out. So I think now, so that's something to keep in mind. Bigger buildings will always have more negotiability because they got to keep those beds full. And the second piece is, the type of renters abandoning units are the younger audiences, typically roommate scenarios. So you might also find a better deal on much bigger apartments than on studios or one beds. So I know, a friend of mine sent me a picture of an exploding supernova, and he goes, "Here we go again." And I said, it's going to be a little bit different this time. It's always a different size star somewhere else in the
always
galaxy.
is.
So if you're looking to upgrade, if you're looking into that, I think I highly recommend using a broker who's going to save you like 90% of the nonsense out there. Plus, I think
know where to go. Know those trends.
But owner operators take brokers more seriously. And the reason is they know the broker's already got a vetted customer, but also they know that broker knows the market. And so when they're giving them an offer, when they're negotiating and giving an offer, it's a much better informed offer.
Yeah.
So those are like non-data driven, high level points that I just have kind of experienced and been through and recommend renters look at.
While just to stick there for a second, we have a question in the Q&A. So if people want to do what you just described, but they have to terminate their lease early, like in very 30 seconds or less, what's that look like? Do people do that? Are there landlords willing to have those conversations because they are confident they'll be able to?
Every single landlord is talking to you about making an easy exit. Either it's a deferment, either it's some sort of settlement, either it's a good guy component, you burn the security. Right now, the entire leverage, whether it looks like it or not, is on the renter's side. And you won't know until you put an offer out there. And frankly, owners should expect to get low offers. If not, they shouldn't be in this business right now, because this is the reality. It's a pendulum, and right now it's very much a tenant-friendly pendulum. So give an offer; it will be considered, and in fact, the less landlords
too crazy. Yeah,
exactly. The less landlords play along, the more pressure there'll be at the state level to force them to play along. So I would say strike a deal and definitely get some consulting on what is fair. You don't want to come in too low, but frankly, that's fine.
Start the conversation.
Start the conversation if
the leverage is on your side. I heard somebody else want to chime in there. Was that Adam?
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely seeing folks want to break their lease. We're ensuring that lease. So, we obviously recommend our residents not to just default, because it puts them in a very bad position for renting into the future. But we definitely are kind of the intermediary between the landlord, the renter, and us as their guarantor. And we're definitely seeing a lot of landlords and even the biggest landlords in New York City are even willing to kind of be somewhat very reasonable, in my opinion, actually, in the current environment. I mean, they understand the hardships. They understand that the current law is not in their favor, and current legislation is not in their favor. So they definitely are open to
and public
having
opinion
conversation.
Yeah,
correct.
I can pin us there for just 30 seconds too on my other life. Like there's a bit of a gap right now between how the governor wants renters to be handled and how the mayor of New York City wants them to be handled. And there's been a lot of back and forth on that, but there's very little doubt, at least in my mind, having watched the emergency response side of this thing come in, to echo what you guys were saying. The renter, the person who's writing a rent check every month, who does not own the property, doesn't have equity in that property, is definitely in the driver's seat when it comes to some of these conversations. Probably now more than ever. Maybe if you wait until the fall, it might have shifted a little bit as we've gotten our head around how we're going to climb out of this. But certainly for right now, I think renters, from what I'm seeing, have the ball really right when it comes to how the legislation and the government and the rules and the executive orders and all that are going to come down. They're not going to necessarily come down verbally and loudly on the side of landlords. So just to keep us moving along here, I want to hold there for a second. We got a couple questions in the Q&A that we'll try to come back to when we're done. But let's pivot back over to that rental insurance work. Adam, can you, I mean, I hadn't really known that that was a thing until I started working with Elegran. Just give us a brief overview of that looks like and how people on the webinar might be able to use that as we climb out.
Yeah, sure. I mean, look, I think a lot of folks across almost every industry have taken a pay reduction in some form. You know, we have a lot of folks. We work with a lot of buildings in Brooklyn and Queens, and where you have a lot of the gig economy working, whether that's through service work or advertising and so forth. And a lot of those people have either been put on furlough and so forth, or are now coming back to their job or starting to work back for their job after they got PPP or federal funding. And a lot of them, if they've taken a pay cut, they might not qualify for a new apartment, especially since it's so hard to qualify in New York City. So
when things were good, it was hard, right?
So typical landlords underwrite to 40 times the rent, the monthly rent, for example. That's a pretty kind of standard New York City standard for underwriting on income. And we underwrite to 27.5 times the monthly rent. So, if you did find yourself in one of those scenarios, which many New Yorkers did, we're here to help and feel free to use us, for a fee. We obviously can be there to help support you and get you into a place that you want to live. And with our opinion, the best deals probably in the last 5 to 10 years are out there now in the rental market because of the inventory, and it gives you an opportunity to look at the all-in cost and be able to get a much better value.
And you may need that for a certain amount of time. Your income may recover 18 months, 2 years from now, but for that interim period, you guys can come alongside and help them get in. Okay, great.
Correct.
Great. So I know the panelists are probably like gritting their teeth at me because I bounced around our agenda pretty well right out of the gate. I don't usually do that, but we did talk a little bit already about concessions. We pretty much covered that. I don't know if Adam, Deborah, Jared, you guys want to add anything else into there? Like we mentioned inventory a little bit. What is concession giving doing to inventory? Are people giving up, other things? That's maybe more people are moving out of the city than moving in. So let's talk just briefly about inventory and anything that concessions that we talked about earlier might impact.
Jared, can I start, Jared?
Sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm only going to use my building as an example, right? Because it's a specific kind of makeup. I think we're going to see people leaving the city more, unless, especially right now where so many are remote, right? So I'm already noticing anybody who was a pied-à-terre or a second home, if it came up at renewal, it's going to be really hard for me to keep them.
Right.
Because they've already in their minds gone, I'm not even using this place, right?
And I'm not going back to New York.
And I'm not going
soon.
back. So, my increase of inventory, I'm traditionally a building that stays very full, maybe 98, 99 guys, almost the whole year. Some bigger renewal months, I might move into a 96 or 97. Right now I'm at 95. I hope to not go bigger than that. But, I know many buildings that are at 90% occupied or, it happens. But I think we're going to see, it's going to be hard for, even the people who are not in their apartments right now and are sheltering somewhere else.
Right.
They are calling and wanting to let go of their apartments early. I'm not that interested. Thank you very much. I understand this was a pandemic and I'll be sensitive, but I just, I can handle it at the renewal side, right? That's where I'll come in and say, I want to keep you, you're a valued customer, and I'm going to sweeten the deal so that you're not leaving. That's where I'm going to be moving into for the next 3 months, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Jared?
Yeah, so to pick on that, just for context, right? The vacancy rate in the city typically hovers around 1.5%. So that means the city usually runs at 98.5% occupancy. So for a building to be, with the 5% or even a 10%, that's incredible. Now, nationally, that's not so in normal, but in New York, that is something that is really, really, really weird to see. Just to give you some context, right now there's about 8,800 rental apartments in Manhattan on the market. We're seeing about 1,000 a week come to market, and we're seeing only about 250 to 270 a week get rented. The new inventory levels are about even with where they were last year. We've caught up after being much lower for much of the spring, but the demand remains to be about 40% of what it was last year. So about 40% few, or about 60% fewer leases are getting signed right now than this period last year. So that's important to know that inventory is going to climb. Not only are we seeing the usual spring and summer inventory start to come, but we're seeing a large uptick in people that are looking to break their leases. Elegran does work with several landlords where we're the preferred vendor for those tenants who are looking to leave early to turn to. Because as Deborah said, a landlord is not going to just let you out of your lease, right? There's no incentive for the landlord to let you out if your lease still runs for another 3, 6, 9, however many months. You're legally obligated to continue paying. But we have been a resource to those tenants to try to find a replacement tenant through a lease reassignment or a sublet.
So as you were saying earlier, the earlier you start that conversation, better, right? So maybe you're 3 months out, but start having that conversation now if you don't know what you're going to do, and not spring it on them at the last minute or ask them to walk away from 8 months worth of rent, right?
Correct. And we are seeing some landlords allow you to break the lease, but the typical penalty is about 3 months rent. So you're going to forfeit your security and usually 2 additional months of penalty for the ones that would even allow you to do it.
Okay. Joe, I think I heard you chime in.
Most of my clients that are allowing lease breaks in this kind of scenario are typically in the 2 to 3 month range as well.
Okay, good. So let's shift for a minute. Jared, you mentioned there's roughly, we were on a webinar conference and we were just talking about some numbers. The sheer number of apartments that are going to be coming up, the growth in the inventory is going to put some pressure on the prices. But you had mentioned that was pretty neighborhood dependent. Are there like some neighborhoods where you could tell people on the call, look, if you're looking for bargains, you got to go here. If you this is the neighborhood where we aren't going to see a lot of slack as you look forward and you see that surge of inventory?
So yeah, in Manhattan, I think Financial District and the Midtown West corridor are going to be some of the more heavily pressured neighborhoods. Finite was largely filled with a lot of people that wanted to live right near work. It tends to be more cramped, more dark, things that don't play well in the stay-at-home environment. And Midtown West tends to be, there's a large amount of rental inventory there. We're seeing a lot of demand in Brooklyn right now. People are generally looking to leave the city and get a little bit more space. So even though there's a lot of inventory downtown Brooklyn, Williamsburg, even up in Queens and Long Island City, those areas have been faring a little bit better. And then we're also seeing a lot of the lease break demands come in from high-end buildings that were, either a pied-à-terre or a second home or somewhere where people, hung their hats on late nights in the city. Because people aren't really enjoying the late nights out in the city, the need for that apartment has sort of shifted.
It's evaporated. So, yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and how does that now extend out to the boroughs and those sort of neighboring areas? I live up in Westchester, and some of the numbers I've heard people renting houses for up here makes your eyes fall out. Like, how long do you think that stays? How big is that movement been? There's a lot of talk around people are going to abandon New York. I know from my own experience after 9/11 and after the financial crisis, a lot of times in the middle of it, people are saying, we're never going to live in New York again. You wait 2-3 years and sure enough, New York is still New York. Just really quickly, how do you guys come down on that? First, let's start with what the rental market looks like around the city, and then what you think, how much relevancy is all of this, no one will want to live in New York ever again stuff?
I'm happy to start. People's memories tend to be short, right? So, while we're in the midst, while we're in the midst of it, people are going to look for other opportunities. We're seeing the tri-state area market very, very strong. There's been a ton of moves from New York out into Connecticut, parts of Westchester, obviously out through the Hamptons and the North Fork. What we're seeing right now is it's going to basically be dependent on what happens with schools in September.
Yeah.
If people go back to school in September and they like their schools in the city, it's going to draw people back. There was an article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago talking about an uptick in enrollment in the Hampton schools. But we'll see. But most people will typically, if school goes back, want to come back home to their home.
To where their school is, sure. Yeah.
Exactly. So between it being a pull from school and a pull from work, that's what we're really going to see. But if people are renting and they don't have a reason to be in New York, their employer's permitting them, to work remotely for a period of time, people may rather save some money, live elsewhere, get some clean air, and not need to pay the high price for the small space, because what is the essence of New York isn't there temporarily.
Right. All the stuff that they pay those prices for, right? We'll turn briefly to sort of some predictions for the future quickly, but like when we look at the current market and all of the stuff you guys have talked about, there's another debate going on with rent versus buy, given where interest rates are. But let's touch on that for a few minutes. I mean, I know it's a complicated topic. We could do a whole webinar just on that, but a little bit of the time we have left, let's talk a little bit about rent versus buy. A lot of bargain hunters are out there. A lot of people have their circumstances changed. Let's chat a little bit about that dynamic. Anybody it's a jump ball. Anybody can hop in.
Yeah,
So
I'll go first.
Go
I'll say that, New York either has to be a part of your life or it doesn't need to be. Right? There's a lot of people that are leaving who will be back. The minute the traffic goes back to normal on the 495, anybody and everyone that's renting out there that has to go to work, whether it's because it's their company or, they need that proximity to the big boss, or whether they're visiting customers, they're really going to think twice about it. So I think what you're seeing now is experimentation. I don't think you're going to see a huge splurge in acquisitions and people are going to buy it. The first property they fall in love with, they're going to test it out. And that's what you're seeing. Hence rental prices are spiking. Rent versus buy doesn't, the interest rate may have a component that's a part of it, but it's really about how long you're going to hold. And so if you need to be in the city and want to be a part of the city and you see it for the long term as part of your wealth management, you're going to buy. And the interest rate, low or high, isn't really going to make that big difference because you might refi. Yes, it's low right now, but most people don't qualify for that low rate. Most people are not going to put 40% down. They're not going to put 25% down. Maybe they'll put 15% down. But those lower interest rates that you're seeing are usually not what's available for first-time home buyers. So anyone that's looking to rent, here's some math I have always found when I make these decisions. Usually, it'll cost you twice as much to own the place you rent in total out-of-pocket housing costs. So if you're renting a place for $3,500, expect to pay at least $7,000 in home ownership, and keep some
to buy it.
To buy it.
Right.
Keep some things in mind. You're going to need about 30%. The bank is going to look at you with a huge question mark, especially now. You're going to have to demonstrate that you're essentially in a part of our economy that is traditionally not affected through these pandemics or active.
Right. Or you run a mask factory. Right.
Yeah, but now everyone's making them. My next door neighbor is giving them away for free.
Them on our kitchen tables. Yep. Good point.
So, and another factor is, does your job require you to have proximity to the city, which will impact whether you are going to buy in the city or not. So I'm a longtime resident of the city. There have been periods where I've lived in the city and not had to live in the city. I think, it's philosophical. It's like, if you think you're in danger, and that's true, living in the city, then you're probably going to live somewhere else.
You're not going to do it.
And you're going to be able to buy it because it's very hard to afford something in New York. So I think there's still some time for this to kind of shake out. And interest rates are going to remain low for quite some time. And
quite a while, that's for
I'm not an economist, but what I know for sure is we're just at the very beginning of even realizing how deep and how broad the financial impact will be on our banking institutions and our lending institutions. So if anything, there are other tools that we could kind of look at to see whether you should buy or rent. Namely, can you afford it and can you qualify for that lower interest rate? And if frankly someone is afraid of their safety, there's 101 things that matter before the COVID in New York. So there's so many other factors that I would weigh. But the interest rates right now, and frankly, full disclosure, I'm currently in the market looking. Michael knows this, and other people that are on your team I've begged for insight. I'm absolutely looking. Not because it's a low interest rate, it's because the fear factor in the seller's mind will benefit me in the negotiation.
In looking for it. I think there's a lot of capital coming in for that reason, actually.
So look at the seller. Look at the seller and see how desperate they are as well.
Right. And Jared, I know we've talked a little bit in the past too, from some of the structural perspectives, there's things that favor renting right now, right? Can you touch on that?
Yeah, I just want to clarify one quick thing with what Joe said. So while the out-of-pocket cost may be double to buy than rent, you know, the net cost is actually much lower because there's tax advantages, you're paying down principal, and there's hopefully appreciation of the asset. So there's a lot more to look at in that formula. I just want to make sure that that's not confusing. So that's why, again, speaking with either your advisor, your financial advisor, your real estate advisor can help to give you context.
Arguably, you get some of that back on the resale, right? Or hopefully more than what you paid on the resale. Whereas if you're renting, it's gone. You only have the value of the utility of the month that you spent. Okay, I'm conscious of our time. We've got a bunch of questions which we'll either get to quickly here or we will reply to you guys. I'll talk about how we're going to do that in a minute. But let's take the last few minutes here and look forward. So how are we climbing out? You know, a lot of people are talking about we're never going to go back to the way we were, or it's going to take forever. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. There'll be some version of normal, but we'll start climbing out of this in the relatively near future. Let's talk a little bit about the panel's market predictions for the rest of the summer and heading into fall. Where do we see things happening as we enter this phase 2, where most businesses can unlock at least a little bit supply and demand? Let's kick that part of this panel off. But okay, I'll target it. Deborah, do you want to start?
Well, what I was just going to bring up, you know, some of the scenarios that I've heard from some of my residents, which is really interesting. Let's say their renewal comes up, they're working remotely. They're paying $7,000 for a gorgeous corner 1-bedroom. They're going to be remote for the next 90 days possibly, especially depending on what firm. So what I've seen is this kind of reverse where they're going, I'm going to buy that property upstate that I've been eyeing, but I haven't put it all together. Try that. And then will I come back into the city? You see, so I think we're going to see an increase in I'm sure upstate New York is doing fabulous because I've spoken to a couple of brokers. I'm in Riverdale, so we've seen an uptake too, guys, but in the probably $2 million range and under. But I think it's interesting, and you can get some really great value up in Hudson Valley, where you get a little bit of land or you just get a little house. So I think it's a reverse. I think some people are going to give that second home, maybe become primary for now, and then decide if they want to come back in later when things open up. Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I'm in a suburb of Connecticut in Westport, where about a third of the town commutes into Manhattan, usually Midtown East. And, both the sales and rental market have been on fire here since the COVID crisis. Obviously a very desirable town. But I think one thing that's going to be interesting is, as people get back to working in the city and essentially instead of commuting every day or 4 days a week, and it gets down to 1 to 2 days a week, will these towns that are commutable, that people are used to commutable, for a 1 hour commute, whether it's Westchester or New Jersey or Long Island or Connecticut, will those specific tri-state towns that have always been kind of the key to the New York City job market, will that change, right? As a lot of tech moves to remote work and allowing remote work, people will try to get better value and they'll move further down the shoreline, or whether it be, they'll move further upstate. And I think we're going to start to see that drastic shift over culture over time. And I think it's too early to tell, but that I think it starts now in the commutable suburbs, and then people will say, oh, you know what, I could actually go a little further and get a lot more value.
Right, especially knowing where we've come from, right? Like I imagine, and you guys can touch on this better, but if I was looking at living in the city now, I would want something that had a rooftop garden or a little space or some light or something that, given where we were, makes being there a little more tolerable, right?
Oh, I agree.
Yeah, definitely.
I agree, guys. I can tell you right now that my amenity space is just, having a garden on the 4th floor, 20,000 square feet for just about 300 apartments. We didn't need to shut that down because you really could social distance out there very nicely. That's been just huge for people.
Been a godsend for people.
You don't leave your house except for shopping, and some people don't leave their house for shopping.
Don't even do that. Yeah.
They have the added value, even though you don't have the gym, you could walk around the garden. And I think the other thing unique to that is people want light and air, right? I mean, if you're going to be in your house, you want a lot of light if you can have it, you know, so obviously a glass tower can make a lot of sense for that. You would want the amenities as well. I agree. Not all buildings have their amenities open, by the way.
True.
The larger buildings don't, my understanding.
We have an interesting question in the Q&A that I'm not sure we can get into in depth, but the question basically says, the buildings had dozens of cases of COVID. How do I pay rent into a place that's literally a threat to my health? Same sort of thing, right? The buildings that have had a lot of cases of this thing are in a different position, even if they do have those spaces available, than the ones that don't, right? And that puts another whole complexion on the value prop of renting versus owning. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, Joe.
No, go ahead.
We are seeing a trend right now in the demand shifting in a couple ways. One is to those smaller, more boutique buildings, so you have to come in contact with fewer people. Two is a shift towards proximity to parks. And three is definitely an increasing in the value. So it's widening the spread between the value of an apartment with light and air and exposure, and that, you know, facing the back of the building or a brick wall, right? The individual that may have rented an apartment because they work 14 hours a day and, you know, they didn't mind looking at the brick wall because it was always going to be dark.
They were never there.
Right. You know, are thinking twice now about that decision. So we see the value of exterior, you know, exposure, outdoor space, and proximity to the parks, the biggest things that people are willing to pay for in the city. I believe that as this unlocks in New York, and this is true in other urban markets across the country, that there is going to be a much larger uptick in activity than ever before, right? People are going to want to move one way or the other because our needs have changed. Our sensitivities to our house has changed. And keep in mind, you know, one of the favorite lines I've heard is, if you were planning to move before COVID, you know, chances are you're probably even more likely to move now, but you're not going to go and buy 90 cups of coffee from your favorite, you know, coffee shop to make up for the last 3 months you didn't leave your residence.
Right. That gets the pent-up demand part of it, right? So everybody wanted to move before, now all the people who have decided, you know what, it wouldn't be a bad idea to move.
Exactly. And then compounding that, so you're going to have the spring, summer, and fall market, in my opinion, all be compressed in about 2 to 3 months, because you're going to have everyone that wanted to move this spring but couldn't. You're going to have the standard summer demand, and you're going to have people that say, well, if this actually comes back in the fall and I got to go back into quarantine, I want to be in my new place now that has X, Y, and Z. So you're going to have all of that compressed, and demand, you know, from a tenant or a buyer can mobilize quicker than the supply. So you're going to see bidding wars happen in certain instances. And even with some of our rental listings now, we're getting multiple bids incredibly quickly, you know, in a day or two on the market, completely from sight unseen, because it has light space, air, outdoor space, you know, these things that are in demand.
And we've talked about before, like the willingness for somebody to rent an apartment sight unseen is a lot higher than buy it and shell out that kind of cash with all the financing and all that. So it's easier to make that. And that's a much less permanent mistake if you do make a mistake, because it renews relatively shortly anyway, right? Okay,
Correct.
Great. All right, well, this has been great, you guys. You know, these hours always go by very, very quickly when we're having all of these different questions and conversations that go on. You know, for everybody on the call, this webinar has been recorded. It will be sent out to you. We have a bunch of questions in the Q&A. I think we got to many of them that we feel comfortable answering here. This isn't the forum to start talking about pricing of particular areas or particular, you know, hypothetical situations in people's individual worlds. That's not really what we can do here. What I would suggest, though, is if you do have those kinds of questions, everybody on this panel is uniquely qualified to help you answer those questions and get you to a place where you'd like to be. So reach out to whoever invited you to this, whether it was one of our panelists, Elegran, whoever, and, you know, have those conversations with you. Can't really get into it here for a lot of different reasons, but I think those questions are really important to be asking now, Same goes for the lease questions. If you have a lot of like, well, how do I do this? Talk to somebody on this panel, because they're all really here for you guys and make sure that you're doing the right thing in the environment we're in. And they each have a perspective into the places we're at now and where we're going to be going, which will help you with those conversations. Let me just scan through here. Any questions I can still throw out to the group? I think we pretty much hit everything, which is awesome. I can speak briefly. There's a question here on the economics. There's two things happening on that side. As you guys have all seen, the country nationally is throwing trillions of dollars at this crisis, and that's going to continue. You're going to see additional, relief packages. There's going to be additional stimulus. There's going to be something done, I think, with rent in the big cities in New York, either federal or state. But from the FEMA perspective, one of the things that's important to flare is we're all very much watching what will come out of last weekend. Memorial Day is a huge socially close thing all the time. This year, I think it was knocked back and it was better, but there were still a lot of people out and about, a lot of people mixing. And so, as the governor always says, tell me what people are doing today and I'll tell you what the virus does in 7 days. They're all, for New York in particular, New York City in particular, all eyes are kind of on what our counts and our trajectory looks like in 7 to 10 to 2 weeks. 7 to 10 days to 2 weeks, because that will tell us how Memorial Day went. And from there, we'll have a much better sense of New York City's trajectory. But the current feeling is that we reopen June 8th, June 15th, something around in there. And then macroeconomically, a lot in terms of what the Fed is talking about, Joe mentioned this earlier, interest rates are not moving upward anytime soon. We are, as he said, we're just at the beginning of this whole thing financially. And so I don't think interest rates will be putting much pressure on the United States economy, and neither will inflation. So I think those are both pretty static for everybody's decision making right now. Whether you can qualify for those really low rates is another question, as we mentioned. And 10-year, the interest rate, the bond interest rates and the mortgage interest rates will always have a little bit of a gap, because the people that are lending that money need to be able to make a little money doing it. So I think that kind of wraps it up, unless any of our panelists have anything left to add. I'll put it out. Wait a minute. If anybody wants to add one more thing, we've got a couple minutes left. All right, hearing none, I want to thank our panelists for coming aboard. Again, this was recorded. Please hold for a minute when we part so you can see the survey. Thanks again to our panelists. If you have any questions about them, please follow up, and we will also be sending the recording out. That'll be a great opportunity to ask further questions. Thank you again for attending.